Hi, welcome to Decoding Confidence. I'm your host, Advita Patel, a confidence and influence coach. And over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to be digging into what confidence actually looks like in the workplace. Not the fake it till you make it stuff, but the real deal. So whether you're navigating tricky stakeholder conversations, trying to get your voice heard in the boardroom, or you're just trying to figure out how to back yourself when the imposter syndrome kicks in, this is your space. I'll be talking to people who've been there, sharing practical tools you can actually use, and unpacking the myths that keep us second guessing ourselves. Enjoy this episode. In today's podcast episode, I want to focus on overconfidence bias. It is a topic that many people ask me about when I talk about confident workplaces and what kind of things do they need to watch out for, not only in terms of their own leadership, but also leaders that they may work with. Now, there's lots of research out there that tells us that overconfidence isn't a personality quirk at all. It's actually a cognitive bias, which can be systematic and sometimes quite predictable in how we behave. And with all these types of episodes that I share with you, I want to start off with a definition of overconfidence bias, because it's important that you understand how it can show up for you and for others as well. So overconfidence bias is basically the tendency to overestimate the accuracy of your own knowledge and judgments or abilities. It's not about arrogance, though, or ego, though those two things can come with it. Of course it can. When someone's a bit more arrogant, they tend to have more overconfidence within them. But it's genuinely about that unconscious gap between how right you think you are and how right you actually are. So just bear that in mind. Like, it's not always with arrogance or ego-driven people. It can play out in many people around you. Psychologists typically identify three types of overconfidence bias. The first is overprecision. This is being too certain that your beliefs are correct. The second is overplacement. This is thinking that you perform much better than anyone else. And the third, which arguably could be the most dangerous for leaders, is overestimation. And this is when you believe that your own capabilities or the quality of your plans and the work that you do are actually higher than what they are. And while you're listening to me sharing these definitions with you, I'm guessing you're probably being able to point out at least 3 or 4 people in your world that this relates to, because I certainly can. And also, just to be very honest with you, I've also fallen down the overconfidence trap many times in my career as well. And I want to share with you as I go along this episodes on how you can stop yourself doing that and just be mindful about how this shows up for you, and also how to manage overconfidence bias in the people that you work with and support and advise, because it's important that you understand how you can manage that around you. And when I was doing research about overconfidence bias for my book, there was lots of research that backed up what I've just shared with you. And one of the most replicated studies in cognitive psychology is when they did that research where people were asked to say how confident they felt in an answer. And those who were like 90% confident in answer were only often right 70% of the time, 75% of the time. And that was systematically, by the way. That was across cultures, it was across professions, it was across contexts. It wasn't like a standout group of people who always misjudged their kind of confidence in things. And you also need to remember, and I want to remind you, that expertise doesn't fix this either. In some domains, actually, the more expert you become, the more overconfident you can get. And that's because competence can create this kind of fluency, and this fluency can sometimes feel like certainty. So when you have or work with a senior leader, for example, or even yourself, you've got like 20, 25 years of success and you've risen through an organization, because of your confidence and because of your judgment has always kind of been validated through that time over and over again, there is risk that you may fall into some of those traps as well. And like I said to you before, I've certainly been falling into some of those myself in overconfidence bias. But this is what we're kind of dealing with on a day-to-day basis in the workplace. There's actually a fascinating body of work and studies that show how power can affect this cognition as well. Because when people feel powerful, they often take in less information from their environment. So they tend to rely more on their own internal state than people around them and experts around them. And they become, in essence, less curious. And it isn't because they're lazy, it's because their brain basically stops flagging the need for them to check things out because they've just worked in this environment where they're just constantly just being told, yeah, that's right, that's great, you're doing wonderful. Some researchers at Columbia found that high-powered individuals are less likely to consider anyone else's perspectives and more likely to attribute the outcomes of their own success to themselves than to external factors. And this is actually quite tough to deal with if you're working with individuals who are like this. So I'm going to share with you a few tips that you can deploy if you are ever in this situation yourself. So if you're working with a leader who's demonstrating this kind of overconfidence in who they are and they're not listening to what you're saying, then the first thing is to reframe the conversation so they actually listen. The instinct when someone isn't listening to you is to say the same thing, but more clearly or more forcefully, or you get agitated and you get defensive. And that rarely works with a leader who's overconfident. Because as I said, the issue isn't that they haven't understood you. It's because that their brain has already discounted that your input is not as important as theirs. So what tends to work in a situation like this is changing the framing entirely. So instead of presenting your perspective as a counter position, which doesn't work with overconfident leaders, you need to kind of embed it into their priorities. So you need to say, I want to make sure this works the way you're intending for this to work, rather than saying, I think this is wrong and this is what might work. Both are fairly similar and contain the same kind of substantive concern, but one invites them into the conversation with you, and the other can put them in a bit of a defensive mode. So lean into those kind of curious questions, because questions are very powerful, much more powerful than statements, especially with a leader with this type of profile. Not passive questions, by the way, but purposeful ones, like ones with real purpose. So things like, what's our assumption here? And what happens if this doesn't work? Who's seen this go wrong in a similar context? And what did they miss? What can we learn from them? Those types of questions can make a leader like that reason inside themselves and examine themselves a bit more intensely than they probably would do, because you're not contradicting them at all. You're actually creating an environment and conditions where the doubt has to come from them ultimately and not you bringing doubt to them, because that just won't work. And the other thing to remember about this reframing is that timing is really important as well. An overconfident leader in the middle of a decision is really difficult to shift their mindset on. So you need to kind of find the right window before that decision feels final, or debrief after something hasn't gone to work or to plan. And I don't mean like, standing there and saying, I told you so, because that never works with anyone, never mind an overconfident leader. But just make sure that you're being quite collaborative and curious with them. If that doesn't work, then the second thing you can do is to build alliances and find other voices in the organization that you're working in. So if your voice alone isn't cutting through, then it doesn't mean that you're wrong. It might just mean that you need amplification from other people, maybe somebody more senior or somebody with a little bit more influence with this individual. So think about in your organization, who else carries weight with that person or with that leader? Is it a peer that they respect? Is it a board member? Is it somebody that they work quite closely with? Is it an external advisor whose opinion that they seek out frequently? Someone from their network who they see as a collaborator or a credible voice can also help. Now, this can be quite a tough pill to swallow when you have to bring somebody else in to back up your point of views. But you have to think about the outcome here, because overconfident leaders do listen, they do, but they just don't listen to everyone. And that can be quite tough, like I said, but you need to use this as a bit of a strategic way of getting your point across. And it isn't about going behind someone's back, and it's about recognizing that influence is systematic, and can't just be this kind of single conversation with somebody. And if you can push that concern with someone that the leader engages with on a regular basis, and that person can raise it with them independently, then that's great, because you're thinking about the core outcome rather than you're right and they're wrong. And direct challenges with these types of leaders don't often work as effectively. So it also means building those lateral alliances and allegiance with people like in HR or communications or finance or legal. And finally, if neither of those two tactics work for you, then you need to know when to escalate and when to walk away. And this is a real difficult one for many folks. There are situations when nothing will work, where overconfidence is so embedded into that individual that they're just not listening to anything you're having to say, and it's pushing you to stay quiet. And it kind of starts becoming this professional risk on yourself, and it can damage your credibility because you're not able to speak up or challenge in the right way. And sometimes when decisions have been made that can cause real harm, especially to employees, the organization, the communities that you're supporting, concerns are being consistently buried because you're not able to speak up can be dangerous. And in those situations, you have to be honest with yourself about what your options are and what you can do about that specific situation. So you've got escalation. So you can escalate it to a more senior leader, to a board director, to a HR person or the HR team. That can sometimes work in your favor. It's uncomfortable. It really is uncomfortable. It can also carry risk, and it can also require you to have documented your concerns clearly, which is why I'll always say to folks, write everything down. But if it's a legitimate professional concern, then you need to escalate, especially if this decision or these decisions that you're feeling challenged with are going to cause harm in the future. And if none of that works, sometimes, and I'm going to say this with caution and with a bit of care, because it's not a decision that you can take lightly, and it's not a privilege afforded to everyone, but sometimes you may need to exit and leave, because not every individual and not every organization can be fixed or will listen to what you have to say. And not every leader can be influenced at all by you having to navigate your entire professional life to manage someone else's issue because they can't check in or be self-aware themselves with their own overconfidence bias. And it's a significant cost to your own well-being and integrity as well. And that is not something you should ever put yourself in path of. Like, your well-being and mental health should never be at risk just because someone else's inability to be self-aware enough to know when overconfidence bias is taking over. So knowing when to stay and when to push, or when to recognize that the situation has moved beyond what you can change, that isn't about giving up at all. And it's not, you've not lost anything, but it's about professional self-awareness. And that's what you need to be aware of. Now, we've spoken about other people's overconfidence bias, but how can you avoid overconfidence bias in yourself? And as I said to you earlier, I've struggled with overconfidence bias in certain situations as well. And one of the things that keeps me grounded is feedback, and honest feedback as well. And this is why I've got my learning circle or my personal board of directors, which I spoke about in a previous episode. It was in the learning habit episode, and I'll put the link in the show notes so you can listen back if you haven't heard it. But my learning circle not only keeps me boosts my confidence and self-esteem, but it also keeps things real for me. It tells me, the people in the circle tell me when I've drunk my own Kool-Aid, and if I'm at risk of saying something that isn't right or accurate or effective just because I think it's right. The other thing I have, and it works really well for me, is an inner critic who I've named Sandy. And Sandy is someone who keeps it fairly real for me. And a lot of folks will give their imposter a bit of a hard time or really freak out about it. But I've actually reframed how I work with my imposter, or inner critic as I now call her. And Sandy keeps me in check. She reminds me if I'm doing something incorrectly and tells me to double check and do due diligence. She tells me if I'm getting carried away with something, and she'll remind me just to make sure that I've reviewed the right documentation, I've listened to the right people, or I've checked the data source properly. That's what she's there to do for me. And that's how I use my inner critic as well. And you do have to manage that really well yourself, because it can overtake and it can knock your confidence as well. So it's all about balance. So if you've got an inner critic or an imposter that you're challenged with, try reframing it. Try using them as your triple checker. Try using them as a support function rather than someone that you are trying to avoid or you don't want to speak with, because it can really change things around. I'm not the biggest fan of things like alter egos. I know Beyonce has Sasha Fierce, and she talks about how Sasha Fierce kind of shows up on stage and gives her this kind of big, bold character. In my opinion, that's taking away from your own success. I rather work with my inner critic and work with them in a way that helps me be a much better person in how I show up for other people. So have a think about how your inner critic shows up for you, and let me know if you have named your inner critic. And I will tell you the story of Sandy as well in a future episode, because she's been with me for a very long time and there's a reason why I named her Sandy. Now, the other thing I want to talk to you about is how success can create this kind of false model in people who are in senior leadership positions, because they got there because they made good calls overall. Their confidence on average is earned. And the problem with this is that past success is a context that can become a template that they can apply or over apply to different contexts. So what I mean by this is there's a leader who's built a very high performing team, but potentially in a stable market. They may genuinely believe that they know how to lead through disruption, but they've had no experience of leading through disruption because they've always led in a stable market. So their overconfidence comes in and their mental model is saying that my judgment works because it's worked before. And statistically, they've been right. And more often than not, to be honest, which is why they've had that promotion or get that kudos in the workplace. But that's where that kind of overconfidence bias and them not being self-aware can be a problem. Now, before we move into what all of this means practically, I want to call out a phrase actually that I believe has done some serious damage to not only individuals, but also how organizations think about confidence. And it's fake it till you make it. I cannot tell you how much I dislike that phrase. It's one of the most repeated pieces of career advice in existence. And you'll find it in TED Talks, you'll find it in leadership manuals, you'll find it in leadership books, you'll even find it in some training. And the challenge with fake it till you make it is that it's a false sense of security. And I want to tell you why. On the surface, it sounds fairly harmless, even fairly helpful, to be fair. Push past self-doubt, back yourself, act confident until you feel it. Confidence follows action. All of that I do agree with. And it feels harmless and it feels like it's going to help you progress with your confidence. But what I want to make a case that this phrase and the culture it's helped to create is one of the reasons why overconfidence bias is so entrenched in leadership. Because fake it till you make it actually tells people to do something, to perform certainty when they don't have it. It tells people to mask that doubt rather than examine what's causing that doubt in the first place. And it's telling people to prioritize the appearance of confidence over the accuracy of their thoughts or their thinking. And it tells organizations implicitly, actually, that this is not only just acceptable, but actually should aspire to be like that. And that's where that imposter comes in. That's when your overconfidence bias shows up. And that's when things can start going drastically wrong for a lot of people. The problem is that organizations don't always get to see the difference between that kind of real calibration and performed confidence. So they promote people that demonstrate fake confidence over rewarding people who may question certain beliefs or question certain systems or are curious about why certain decisions are being made, because organizations have been conditioned to build belief and push people who demonstrate that certainty. I'm not saying that is wrong. You do need a leader who is certain and can make decisions and is determined and direct, but not when they're faking it. And that's when the problem can be catastrophic in a culture, when people are pretending that they know something and it starts to become a culture problem. And fake it till you make it is part of that cultural foundation that causes that chaos. Now, like I said, I'm not saying that there's a zero value in fake it till you make it. There is genuine psychological studies and research, mainly by Amy Cuddy, who I love and adore, and I've followed her work for a long time. She talks about this, suggesting that this physical and behavioral state can put you and influence you in an internal emotional state. So the power pose and self-talk and having your shoulders back and your head up, all of that can definitely help you feel calmer, can reduce anxiety. And that is true. That is definitely true. But there's a significant difference between managing your own anxiety so you can think more clearly and projecting false sense of security or certainty to the people that you're supporting. That isn't what fake it till you make it should be used for. You can fake knowledge and expect people to believe in you in that way. And that's something that you have to be very cautious about. One is about self-regulation, which is what Amy Cuddy talks about, and the other is very much about fake performance. And when fake it till you make it collapses and causes that catastrophic damage, it can almost erode trust, and it can take away trust not only in the organization, but trust in yourself. And that's something that you have to be very cautious about. The leaders who do the most damage with overconfidence bias are not cynical people. They're not even the ones with the biggest ego. So one thing I want to leave you with before I end this episode is that overconfidence bias in leadership isn't about bad people or people having big egos or being arrogant. It is a kind of human cognitive challenge that can be amplified when people are not feeding back or giving honest feedback to leaders in organizations. Like, how many of us have worked in organizations where people are frightened to speak up to a leader or even fearful of saying the wrong thing in case there's repercussions to what they are saying? So you end up kind of staying quiet, like I said before, and that doesn't help your well-being, it doesn't help your mental health, and it doesn't help the organization be better either, and it doesn't help people be their best selves. But we need to be able to work with these overconfident types of leaders and question them in the right way and be curious, because tapping into that is going to support the organization to keep on performing and growing and thriving, and also allow other people to thrive and be better and be able to be their best selves as well. So next time you're in a room where a decision is being made with total certainty by somebody and something in you doesn't think that feels right, then trust that instinct and ask that curious question and create that space for others to ask that question as well. Because the antidote to overconfidence bias isn't a lack of confidence, it's curiosity. And curiosity requires us and people around us to be willing to speak up and be honest about what we don't know or don't agree with, and being able to ask those questions of those leaders and peers that we work with. I hope today's episode was interesting and you took a lot away from it. If it did work for you and you found it interesting, then please do forward it on to somebody that you think will learn a lot from it or be able to at least share with others in their network as well. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you've got any questions about what we've discussed today or any of the previous episodes, you can leave me a DM on any of my social platforms. All the details are in the show notes, or you can email me at advita@decodingconfidence.com. If you're curious about which of the 7 habits you should focus on first, then I've got a brand new quiz for you to undertake. All the details are in the show notes. Let me know how you get on. I'll speak to you soon.